It's St. Patrick's Week, and you know what that means. Lots and lots of green clothing, tons and tons of beer, and most importantly in my book, some really good corned beef. And that's why today we're making corned beef from scratch. Now, it's not a terribly difficult thing to make, but it's one of those things that takes some time and preparation. I guess you can kind of compare it to smoking your own meat. Really, you're not doing much hands-on work to the product itself. Instead, there's just a lot of time that goes by, and that time creates flavor and amazing food. And that's exactly what we're gonna do with corned beef, but we're gonna take it up a notch. Why not make corned beef with a little bit of Wagyu? And we're not just gonna stop at corned beef, because obviously I could just make some video of me making corned beef, slicing a few cuts and holding it up and showing off all that juiciness, and then maybe taking a few bites out of it. But again, we're gonna go a step further than that. We're gonna make the most incredible corned beef Reuben sandwiches that you have ever seen. They're gonna be cheesy, they're gonna be juicy, they're gonna have an amazing sauce. To put it simply, they are going to blow your mind. And it all starts with this. What we have right here is a 13-pound American Wagyu brisket. If I flip it over here, you can see that it's got an enormous fat cap. This right here is gonna help us make the most incredible Wagyu brisket we can possibly make. Now, the first thing you might wonder is, why is it American and not Japanese? And the reason is simple. In this case, Japanese Wagyu won't work. There's just way too much fat. This will have that perfect amount of marbling, still allowing us to get that really juicy corned beef while still holding together really nicely. For my first order of business, I'll try to take this out of the wrapping without puncturing any of the meat. You already know that I got this Wagyu brisket from the Wagyu shop, and I haven't been shy to tell you that it's my go-to spot when it comes to Wagyu. To start things off, let's get rid of this plastic wrapping here. To start, we're actually gonna let this brine for about a week. We wanna absolutely pump this thing with flavor. And just look at how thick this bad boy is. I mean, this isn't just thick. This is thick with a bunch of K's and Q's at the end. I'm about to blow your mind with how many spices are gonna go into this thing, so let's go. Like I said, we're not gonna be holding back today when it comes to spices. We want so many seasonings to really just pump in as much flavor as we possibly can to this brisket. So we'll start by dry toasting off some of these things to really bring out the additional flavor. First, I'll put a little handful of garlic cloves in there. Keep in mind, the heat's off at this point. Next, I have a few fresh bay leaves. If you've never seen fresh bay leaves, they're actually not too difficult to find in the market, and I find them to be a heck of a lot better than those dried ones. Next, we're gonna go in with a few peppers, chiles, whatever you want, for some flavor and perhaps a tiny bit of kick. Then, just a little bit of fresh chopped ginger. But we're not done yet, not even close. These look like peppercorns, but they're all spice berries, so a little handful of those too. Then, just to confuse you, a bunch of peppercorns. You'll notice that those are a lot smaller than allspice berries. After that, a few cardamom pods. Cardamom pods are so incredibly potent that I keep them in a bag inside the actual spice jar. Otherwise, the rest of your spices are gonna smell like cardamom pods. I'll sprinkle in only a few of those because they're very potent. After this, we'll do a few whole cloves, which again are quite potent, so we don't wanna overdo that. A sprinkle of fennel seeds, which I absolutely love. A couple of cinnamon sticks, 1 or 2 pieces of star anise, a tiny touch of cumin seed, a few brown mustard seeds, a few yellow mustard seeds, and to finish it off, just a little bit of salt. I don't think toasting salt does anything, but we're gonna put it in there just for good measure for now. We'll crank up the heat and just lightly spin these around until they get a little bit aromatic. Spices can be really easy to burn, especially when you're cooking them dry like this, so just be careful. Once you start to hear the crackles like this, only let it go for another 30 seconds or so, and then your spices are ready to go. Now, because this is gonna sit in the fridge for a while and brine and cure, we can actually use an alternative instead of curing salt, which most people probably don't have in their kitchen at home. If you simply juice your own celery or buy some celery juice, you can use a little bit of that instead. We're just gonna juice off some of these stalks of celery. To make this work, we only really need a couple of stalks here. It's just a nice alternative to have if you can't find pink curing salt anywhere. And either way, don't worry about it too much, because we're gonna be slow cooking this meat for several hours, so it's gonna be cooked one way or another. Once that celery juice is done, reserve this off to the side. We're ready to put all the parts together. To start here, I have a nice big large container that I've cleaned out really well. Into it, I'm gonna drop my massive brisket. Then I'll follow by filling this about 2/3 of the way up with some cold water. Next, because it is St. Patrick's Day, I'm gonna crack open a beer. That's definitely gonna add a little bit of flavor here to our brine. And you can use whatever kind you'd like here. Actually, why not just a few more? We gotta get in the spirit anyway. Our next step here is gonna be to add all those spices, so let's pour those in. That right there is where the real flavor is gonna come from. After this, we're gonna add in about 3 cups of salt, and I'm actually gonna do a few kinds of salt just to mix it up a little bit here. Finally, to get a little sweetness, I'll do a nice little drizzle of honey in there, which I always think just adds a nice unique flavor. About 2/3 a cup of brown sugar, which again will give a little bit of sweetness, and either some pink curing salt or this creative alternative of celery juice. Once that's all set, let's mix things around just a little bit in here and shove down that brisket to make sure everything is well submerged. You might wanna take just any sort of plate or bowl and make sure that the brisket's weighted down so that it's constantly fully submerged by this liquid. We're now gonna sit this in the fridge for about 5 to 7 days to let those flavors pump in and create the juiciest, most amazing corned beef you have ever seen. I'll see you in a couple days. And after a whole week, we are back. Take a look at this beautiful brine that we've made. Our meat's been curing for about 7 days, and you can actually even leave it up to 10 or so if you want to, but I just couldn't wait any longer. And if I do, St. Patrick's Day is gonna be long gone. An easy first step here is gonna be for me to take out this plate at the top that's weighing everything down. It's done its job. We don't need this anymore. I first wanna add that this smells incredibly good. It's this really deep, rich, complex, beefy stock. And I know we never heated it up or anything, but we've been sitting it here for so long, and as you saw, we put in so many beautiful toasted off aromatics and herbs in here. Floating at the top, I see all the fresh bay leaves, some of the peppers. I know they look like chilies, but I think they're peppers. Then we have our star anise, a bunch of peppercorns, and our cloves. And it looks like down on the bottom, we have a lot of those bigger bits, like the ginger. Next time, I'd probably toss in a couple lemon hunks too. But for now, I'm gonna try to pull this big boy out. It's funny, there's no really good way to grip this thing, and the further out of the water I lift it, the heavier it gets. But it is looking really good. For now, I'm gonna move this container out of the way. Then, primarily because I just simply can't hold it anymore, I'll plop it down. The first order of business here is gonna be to rinse off this big piece of meat right here. So give me just 1 second. Now that we've gotten a nice rinse on this absolute beauty, we gotta slice it up. Because I simply don't have a pan that's big enough to cook this whole thing, our first step here is just gonna be to cut it in half. And actually, I think this is a good thing, because as you can see, this thing is very different in shape throughout the whole piece. Which means, of course, that this part's gonna cook a lot faster than this part over here. So I'm gonna try to make a nice cut right down the middle to really separate this out and give us 2 nice, even pieces, which will give us time to mess around and eat this one first. Then this will be ready. Because I'm really curious, let's just first take a look through the middle. If you look really closely on the edges, you can see that it's been curing in from the outside and that this part's already starting to get some color. But what we really want and what we're happy about is that there's that nice bright red pink meat in the middle here, and that's perfect. I'm already more excited about this other piece here, because while this has a big giant fat hunk of fat right here, this section here has a lot better marbling for our corned beef, which I'm more excited about. Now we obviously can't forget about our stock here, our curing liquid if you will. So at this point I'm gonna strain out all the solid bits that are in here because we want to continue that flavor all the way through the rest of the cooking process. All these solids look really nice together, and we have such a fantastic spread of things here. Like I said, it'd be such a huge shame to waste all of these and just throw it away when we go to cook our corned beef through. I really wish I could describe the smell coming off these, but all I can really tell you is that it's fantastic. Something about just letting those soak for so long with all of that beef. Seems like the beef and that water even pumped some flavor back into these herbs themselves, as in everything collected seasoning from what was next to it, which is something I love about cooking. Now, because we're cooking in 2 pots, let's divide this evenly across both before we begin to cook. Now to start, we're gonna divide all these seasonings between the 2 pots. So first I'll sprinkle just a little bit in here, trying to make sure I get a nice even spread of them, and then I'll do the rest right in here. This water just came off the stove and was about boiling, but I'm gonna quickly tough it out and grab a few more bay leaves because I know this one needs more. Once we've done that, I can immediately see the color start to happen in this water right here, and that's great. But now we need to do what we've all been waiting for and add in that meat. Oh, clearly not one of the smartest things I've ever done when cooking, but not a mistake that we can't fix. Let me try that again. The reason I have so much water in these is because I really want it to be covered all the way up with that water. So if I need to pour a little bit off at the end, that's okay. For the second one, we should be better prepared since we just learned the hard way. I'll drop that piece of meat right into that water. Almost everything you're ever gonna learn about cooking is gonna strongly suggest that you never wanna boil beef, or any meat at all for that matter. It just goes so far against everything that you learn when it comes to getting that nice perfect sear or a crust on something. Who doesn't love that golden brown crispiness? But this is how you make corned beef. So for the first 20 minutes, we're gonna let these boil off right behind me. After that, for about 3.5 hours, they're gonna cook on low and just slowly get those nice juices flowing. So we'll see you guys in a little bit. To start off with our rye bread, because for a good Reuben sandwich, you've gotta have rye bread, we'll do about 2.5 cups of lukewarm water. I like to take the temperature so it's just about 110 degrees Fahrenheit, but as long as it's slightly warm to the touch, you're pretty good here. It's just gotta be warm enough that it's gonna wake up your yeast. I'm sitting here trying to measure out my molasses, and now I understand why people say slow as molasses. This is just about one of the slowest things I've ever watched pour out. Are you freaking kidding me? It can't go any faster than that? Now, about 10 minutes later, and hopefully our water's still warm, we'll slowly drizzle in about 2/3 cup of molasses. We always put some sort of sugar when we wake up yeast, and because this is pretty much just burnt sugar, that'll do exactly the trick. And it also goes along with that unique, darker rye bread type vibes that we need for this bread. Once we put that in, first whisk it up just a little bit to let that kind of dissolve in that water. Then, just so that the water's still warm, slowly slowly sprinkle in about 2 packets or 4.5 teaspoons of active dry yeast. I'm using platinum yeast here to really take it up a notch. I figure for that small difference in price, it can get you a lot better final product in bread. After we've whisked this around a little bit, let it sit for about 5 to 10 minutes. We want that yeast to wake up. Now once we've given that a chance to wake up a little bit, we're gonna add about 2 tablespoons of caraway seeds, a small little pinch of salt, 1/4 cup of vegetable oil, 1/4 cup of unsweetened cocoa powder, again to give some of that darker color for our rye bread. And then I'll attach my dough hook and then slowly mix in 5 cups of bread flour and 2 cups of rye flour, which you can either order online or find at some place like Whole Foods at times. Slowly let this mix as you continue to add in some of those flours. It's really exciting watching everything come together, but make sure you have some additional flour handy in case you need to add a little bit more. Once that dough is all set, we'll lift up our mixing bowl, and by now it should be in a nice big clump that we can just take out. We'll knead our dough just a tad bit more here, really trying to shape it into a nice ball form if we can. This dark color on here is amazing, and I'm really hoping it holds like this all the way through the cooking process. Once we've kneaded this for about 5 to 7 minutes, including that time in our mixer, get it into the roundest shape you possibly can. Lightly grease a large glass bowl, and then drop in that dough. Now we'll cover it up for about an hour and a half and let it rise. Now obviously we can't have any good Reuben sandwich without some sauerkraut. And I'll admit it, I'm not the biggest fan of sauerkraut, but when you combine it with all these amazing things that we're gonna be putting together, it's quite good. It gives that acid, it gives that punch. So first with our head of cabbage, I always like to peel off the outer layers. This is actually one of the few things in the kitchen that I feel like I don't really clean. It's almost a self-cleaning vegetable. You peel off those layers and it is good to go. Now, if you want, you can definitely use some sort of equipment to help you shred it, but I'm just gonna try to do this on my own. First, I'll chop it right in half. The only thing inside the cabbage that we don't want is these 2 little stems right in the middle here. So I'll take my knife and come at an angle to take those out. Once we've wedged out that piece right through the middle, you can see that the rest of the cabbage is perfectly good to eat. This is just a little bit too tough. Now, I'll rest my cabbage face down and I'll chop slowly going back to get these really nice thin bits. You can see when I lift these up and then break them apart that they're perfectly shredded cabbage. If you're not very comfortable in the kitchen, this is one of those things where it's a really great time to work on those knife skills. Put your hands forward in a claw like this and then let it guide you back as you go across the whole thing. Your thumb in the back can also be used to push this slowly forward as you go. I like to think of my hand as an inchworm here. It sort of goes back and forth like this as I slide back over the top of whatever I might be cutting. Now let's finish chopping this up. You can see once this is all done that we have a beautiful mound of this really well shredded cabbage. This is gonna make some damn good coleslaw. Now in a pan we'll do 1 cup of vinegar, 1 cup of water, and about a half an onion, which I like to put into nice little strips just like the cabbage. Then once this starts to bubble, we'll add in our whole head of cabbage. But keep in mind, you may have to add it slowly and stir because at the start this is gonna have quite a bit of volume to it. As quickly as you can, press that down and stir it around a little bit. Let it start soaking in that acidic water. Once we're all set here, let's add a nice little sprinkle of salt, which will help to kind of mush down that cabbage and draw even more water out to give it that nice texture that we're ultimately looking for. Then we'll go in with just a little bit of fresh cracked pepper. Then after that, a little bit of onion powder, a little bit of garlic powder, and to finish it off, a little bit of celery seed, or in this case, a little bit of celery salt. You should immediately get a burst of amazing flavor. Mix it up to make sure everything is well combined. I'd also recommend giving it a nice taste to make sure it's well seasoned. Place down a lid and cook this for about 10 to 15 minutes over low heat. This is where we let those flavors marinate. Once our sauerkraut is nice and tender, I'll lift it out and put it into a nice glass mason jar. At this point, I'm gonna go ahead and sit it in the fridge, all really nicely packed together, and let it kind of blend together for a few more hours. Then when it comes time to make our sandwich, we'll have a beautiful, well-marinated sauerkraut. Just look at that. So incredibly easy to make, but we already know it's gonna be so much better than anything we could have ever bought at the store. Now, of course, we need our Russian dressing. Probably one of my favorite parts about a Reuben sandwich. First, I'll go in with about a cup of sour cream. Keep in mind, you can really start playing around with amounts here when you make this recipe. You don't have to be perfect with every single amount here. Just have a little fun with it. Next, I'm gonna go in with about a cup of mayonnaise. As usual, I'm using Japanese mayonnaise just because I think that provides a little bit of extra acidic and unique flavor. Next, I'm gonna go in with about a half a cup of ketchup. Ketchup will give us that nice lighter orangey color that you get in Russian dressing. After this, I'll do about a 1/3 cup of chopped up dill pickles, and then out of that same pickle jar, just a tiny bit of our pickle juice. And then I'll bring in a really cool ingredient, some fresh horseradish. Yes, it's oddly shaped, but it's fine to use. And for me here, I'm gonna grate in a little bit less than a tablespoon, but I would say that depending on your tolerance for spice, you can up or down this as much as you want. I highly prefer fresh horseradish to the ones that are in a jar. To finish it off, I'll give it a nice little squeeze of lemon, a little bit of fresh cracked pepper, and a nice little sprinkle of salt. Mix this all together to combine it really well, then just give it a nice little taste to make sure that it's seasoned properly. This dressing is fantastic, so I'll toss it in the fridge with the sauerkraut to bring this back back out later when we assemble our sandwich. Now at this point, it's time we can return to our bread and get that all sorted. As you can see, it's risen quite a bit. And I can actually tell by some of the cracks in there that it's actually fallen back down a little bit, which happens after a while when you let bread rise for a long, long time. Eventually, it just can't hold itself up anymore. To start, just give it a little tap. The second you do that, you're gonna see it shrink down a bunch, and that's okay, because we're gonna let it rise again. Onto our work surface, I'll toss down a bunch of flour, and then gently lift off my rye bread. Now, I sort of wanna make one giant loaf, so I'm gonna start shaping this into a nice big loaf. Really just tuck it under itself and make that nice perfect log shape. Just keep in mind that at the end, we wanna be able to cut into this and get some really nice slices of bread. So as you shape it here to however you might desire, really keep that in mind. Once we've gotten this into a nice loaf shape like I have here, I'll bring in my baking tray with a Silipat liner on here and lay down my loaf. Now again, we'll place our towel over the top and let it rest for about 45 more minutes. After that, we'll be ready to bake. Once our rye bread has finally had time to sit and rest, we can go and bake this beautiful thing. I'm gonna lightly dampen the outside of the whole thing first, and you can use a mister for this if you have one. And now once I've dampened this just a little bit, this will go into the oven at about 350 Fahrenheit for 40-50 minutes or so. Just keep a nice eye on it, and if you can, for the first 10 minutes or so, mist it a few times again just to get a little bit of water on there. You wanna keep everything nice and moist while still getting that really hard crust in the end. Let's let this baby cook. Well, finally, after 4 hours of waiting, this is complete. Yes, I know we've all been waiting for this corned beef. And trust me, I have quite literally been sitting here the entire day, smelling everything. So it's been even harder for me to wait for this. I've actually taken several spoonfuls of the broth that's a combination of all those aromatics and spices we added in, as well as the fat that's dripping off of here. Partway through cooking, I also decided to add a few beets in here to hopefully kind of boost up that color of this just a tad bit more. I'll be honest, there's gonna be no clean way of doing this. This is gonna be messy one way or the other. So I'm just gonna apologize to my cutting board and go for it. First, let's drop down our juicy meat. Look at that jiggliness.
The way she wobble, way she wobble, way she wobble.
Now again, there's gonna be no easy way to do this, but I'm just gonna start cutting and let's just see what happens. Let's take our first nice slice into this. As you can see, it's just about as juicy as one could possibly get. And I know, I'm not supposed to squeeze it, but I had to. Let's just take a few more slices of the stuff just to see what happens. Looking at that, I'm absolutely blown away. We let this thing slow cook literally the entire day. So how can you not get excited about all that juice? Even all of that fat on the top is just pouring out of this corned beef. Now we can't do any of this without placing down our other juicy boy. And as we already know, this one was thick as can be, so let's slice into it. It is just absolutely oozing juice. Something about this is such an incredible experience to me. That's gotta be some of the juiciest meat ever. Not just corned beef, but ever, that I have ever come across in all of my cooking. Now, I'm gonna cut a really nice thin slice here to actually start getting pieces that we can put in our corned beef Reuben. I'm really cutting those bigger, thicker slices just for you to be able to see what exactly we achieved. And as I cut one of these thin slices, I'm gonna show you something that we're looking for here. When we make corned beef, what we're actually looking for is some nice separation between all of this meat. We don't want it to be so fall apart that it literally falls apart when we cut it, but we almost want it to look sort of like an accordion or a slinky when we pull it like this. This separation that we see here shows that we achieved perfect corned beef. Now, we don't have quite that reddish color that you might have if you use curing salt, and obviously we use celery juice, which is said to be somewhat of a healthier alternative when it comes to this. But we know that this is fully cooked through to that perfect level, and the important part is that it's beautifully tender. If I want to, I can also shave off some of that fat right off the top and kind of layer it on my meat to make it even fattier. That way, when I go to lay it into my sandwich, it'll have that perfect marbling with every bite. At this point, I think we're ready to assemble a sandwich, so let's do it. The second our bread came out of the oven, I began resting it on this wire rack. Take a look at that beauty. It's a big, hefty loaf of bread. Most people probably would have divided up the dough we had to start, but I just wanted to make a ginormous loaf. That'll of course translate to a ginormous Reuben sandwich. It's been resting long enough now that I'm gonna slide it onto my cutting board and try to make a few nice slices. First, let's come right down the middle. Now we open it up. This bread is exactly what we were looking for. While it may not have those massive gaps that you have in something like sourdough, that's not what we're going for here. We've made more of a dense type of bread here, which is perfect because when we go to toast this off a little bit in our pan before adding that sandwich together, we'll have a really nice even toasting throughout the whole thing. There are no gaping holes for our sauce to fall through. So this bread is everything I wanted and more. I'll try to get a few nice slices with my knife here, noting that as I cut, I can smell that really traditional flavor one might find in a traditional rye loaf. Once we've gotten a few nice slices, we're ready to build our sandwich. To toast our bread, I'll start with one little layer of mayonnaise on the top of the bread. I know, it sounds weird, but it's every chef's secret to the perfect grilled cheese, so why not use it on everything? Then, after we've covered it in mayonnaise, I'll do softened butter. So we're looking at equal parts butter and equal parts mayo. When that's set, I'll place this slice of bread face down. Now, it's gonna be hard to tell whether or not we got a really nice golden brown toasting on a slice that's already darker than even the most perfectly toasted piece of bread. But you're just gonna have to trust me if you can't tell here and know that there's a perfect toasting on there. If you don't toast your bread in some way before making a sandwich, that's just pure laziness. Come on. We'll do the same exact thing with our other slices. To start the assembly here, let's layer down our fresh corned beef. You'll notice I have quite a bit of fat left on here, and that's on purpose. Fat is awesome, and we gotta have more people understand that. The other thing is, when layering a sandwich, really try to make sure that everything is nice and level. You don't want your sandwich all lopsided and everything falling off. And as you can see here, unlike most sandwich shops these days, I am not holding back on the amount of meat we put on here one bit. In fact, I'm gonna use a big, thick, juicy mama for that last slice there, because I just know that's gonna be unreal. As our next step here, let's add on some of that homemade sauerkraut. Again, that was one of the easiest steps to make, and a lot of people would just say, hey, let's go buy some sauerkraut. But people, come on, you know we don't buy things like that. We make them from scratch. Once we put on a ridiculous boatload of sauerkraut, it's time for one of the best parts, our Swiss cheese. On this, I'm gonna do 4 nice big slices of Swiss. We're gonna really let that melt down and go over the side of this thing. And you know how we're gonna melt it, right? Our little culinary torch. Slowly go back and forth and let that cheese fall down over the sides. The key here is we want to hold it far enough away that we don't get it too golden brown, but that it gets that residual heat and essentially starts melting off the edges. Once the cheese begins to really curl around the sandwich is when we know we're doing a good job. And towards the end here, I'll also give it a little bit of that golden brown color, because that actually provides a ton of flavor too. But at least at the start, we just want to be really careful here. The other thing we can do is hit some of this fat here. Those crackles will mean we're rendering off some of that fat, which provides, again, more flavor and a little bit of crispiness on there too. After just a few more moments here, our cheese melting process should be complete. Just look at that bubbling, incredible goodness. Now the last thing we have to do here, of course, is finish it off with a little bit of our sauce. That Russian dressing is something amazing. Now to complete the sandwich, we'll place down the top piece of bread, and that right there is our Reuben. About as homemade as you could possibly get for a Reuben, other than actually growing the cow before slaughtering it. Let's say we give it a try. For those of you that don't believe me, first I want to show you how crispy that top is. Pretty crispy, right? Now let's slice through this baby. But of course, very, very gently. Fortunately, it was actually quite the clean cut. Now let's look at the middle of this thing. At this point, I don't really have any words to say. I'm just gonna stare at it for a little while. And again, please don't yell at me for this, but I just wanna show you how juicy this thing is. To be perfectly honest, I'd have no shot at biting into this thing regardless if I didn't squeeze it down a little bit. So let's give it a try. As they say, here goes nothing. You know, it's funny. Every time I come into this kitchen, I'm never sure if we can top what we did before. There's always so many cool things that come through here, and I feel like I've probably said this before. I feel like I've probably had this monologue before. But what I'll say is this. At this very point in time, when I took a bite into this sandwich, I knew right away that we could always keep topping what we're doing. Each and every time we're gonna make something even crazier from scratch. You know, next time we're gonna go to the farm where this cow came from, and we're gonna lug that meat ourselves back into this kitchen before we cure it. Or we're gonna go search and find all of those different little herbs and spices, and we're gonna take them right ourselves out of the wild. That's really the only way I can see that we can step something like this up at this point. This is fabulous. Let me go through what I'm tasting. First, because I've marbled so much fat and meat in there, that has to be the star. And it is. The fat permeates your whole mouth as soon as you bite into this thing. And it's this extremely flavorful but gentle fat. Then of course you get the meat. That meat breaks and falls apart so incredibly easily when you bite it. It just crumbles in your mouth. Smothered on top of that is some of our Russian dressing, which is so amazing yet simple. There's a little bit of acid in there, but that acid is overwhelmed in a great way by the homemade sauerkraut, which traditionally wouldn't be fresh at all. In fact, sauerkraut is one of those things that sits there in a jar forever. It's preserved. Yet this has that same punch without tasting so old and so wilted. It's this fresh, crisp sauerkraut with a really uplifting type of acid in it. Then of course that rye bread. Sure, I'll be honest, it's a bit more dense than typical bread that I really love. I'm more of a lighter, fluffier sourdough type of person. I like that really nice hard crust on the outside, which we have, but I like the inside to be a little bit better spaced out. Somewhat like the marbling you might like in a steak. That nice blend between fat and meat. I like that same kind of thing in bread with air and bread. And then of course that cheese on top. This is a home run. I hope you love this video, and even more so, I really hope you'll toss a like if you enjoyed watching it, because it took over a week to make. It's a lot of time to spend on one video, but I'll do it every time for you. In the meantime, if you want to make this whole thing or even any elements from it, go for it. Also make sure to toss a comment below, and most of all, don't forget to subscribe. If you're already subscribed, thank you, but you gotta make sure you join that notifications gang too, because that list grows faster and faster every day. And for now, it looks like I've got a sandwich to finish. I'll see you next time.